Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the New Horizon and watched the stars drift past the viewport. His ship was one of 50 human vessels scattered across the galaxy, doing survey work for the Galactic Council. The work was quiet and peaceful, which suited Jake just fine. He had never been one for loud voices or grand gestures. Lisa. Grant sat at the navigation station, checking their course to the next system. She had worked with Jake for 3 years and knew he preferred things calm and orderly. Pete Rodriguez was down in engineering, making sure their jump drive stayed in perfect condition. Amy Bell monitored communications from her station near the back of the bridge. They were a good crew, and Jake trusted them completely. The Galactic Council had 12 member species, and humans were the newest. They had joined only 20 years ago, after first contact with the Zephyrians. The Zephyrians could read minds and speak without words. The Krolix built machines that seemed almost magical. The Thrakari were born warriors who could fight with any weapon. The Valthan were natural strategists who won wars before they started. Humans had no special gifts that anyone could see. They could not read minds like the Zephyrians or build impossible machines like the Krolix. They were not natural fighters like the Thrakari or brilliant generals like the Valthan. What humans did well was talk and find peaceful solutions to problems. The other species found this useful, but not particularly impressive. Ambassador Veltar of the Zephyrians had written in his reports that humans were pleasant enough, but unremarkable. They had no telepathic abilities worth mentioning. Their technology was basic compared to Krolix standards. Their military was small and focused on defense rather than conquest. Most importantly, they seemed to prefer talking their way out of trouble rather than fighting. Jake had read those reports and found himself agreeing with most of them. Humans were not the strongest or smartest or most advanced species in the galaxy. They were just good at getting along with others and finding compromise solutions when conflicts arose. Jake thought this was probably for the best, since the galaxy had enough warrior races already. The New Horizon dropped out of hyperspace near a yellow star with 7 planets. Their mission was to survey the 4th planet for possible mining operations. The Krolix had detected unusual mineral signatures from long-range scans. Jake ordered a standard approach pattern and began the routine checks that came with every new system. Lisa ran her scans and found something interesting on the 4th planet's largest continent. There were ruins scattered across several hundred square kilometers. The energy signatures suggested the ruins were very old, but the materials were still intact. Jake felt a familiar excitement at the prospect of discovering something new. They spent 3 days mapping the ruins from orbit before. Jake decided to take a landing party down to investigate. Pete stayed with the ship while Jake took Lisa and Amy to explore the largest structure. What they found changed everything Jake thought he knew about the galaxy. The ruins belonged to a species called the Architects, according to the inscriptions they found. The Architects had built cities that could house millions of people. Their technology was more advanced than anything the current galactic species possessed. They had developed weapons that could destroy entire star systems and shields that could protect whole planets, but the Architects were gone. Every trace of them had been wiped out except for these ruins on this one planet. The evidence suggested they had been destroyed not by war between their own kind, but by something from outside. The galaxy. Something that had come from the dark spaces between galaxies and consumed everything in its path. Jake spent hours studying the final messages left by the Architects. They described an enemy that could not be reasoned with or defeated through. CONVENTIONAL. The messages spoke of creatures that fed on life itself and grew stronger with each world they destroyed. The Architects had tried everything they could think of, but nothing had worked. Amy found records showing that the Architects had sent out warnings to other galaxies before they were destroyed. They had tried to prepare others for what was coming. The messages described tactics that had failed and weapons that had proven useless. The final entries talked about something called the Great Silence. That would fall across the galaxy when the enemy was finished. Jake gathered all the data they could carry and prepared to return to the ship. He knew the Galactic Council needed to see this information immediately. The ruins proved that advanced civilizations could be completely destroyed by unknown forces. If the same enemy that killed the architects was still out there, then every species in the galaxy could be at risk. The flight back to Council space, Jake found himself thinking about the architect warnings. They had described an enemy that consumed entire worlds and could not be negotiated with. Jake had always believed that any problem could be solved through careful discussion and compromise. The architect records suggested that some enemies could only be stopped through overwhelming force. Jake filed his report with the Council as soon as they reached the nearest communication relay. He recommended immediate investigation of the ruins in preparation for possible threats from outside the galaxy. The Council thanked him for his thoroughness, but classified the threat as low priority. There had been no signs of extragalactic enemies for thousands of years, and the Council had more pressing concerns. Jake returned to his survey duties, but he could not stop thinking about the architect warnings. Something about their final messages bothered him. They had described an enemy that came without warning and showed no mercy. Jake hoped the Council was right, and the threat was ancient history. But deep down he felt that something was coming and the galaxy was not ready for it. The first sign that something was wrong came during a routine council meeting on Tuesday morning. Ambassador Veltar of the Zephyrians collapsed at his station while discussing trade agreements with the Krolix delegation. His telepathic screams echoed through the minds of every psychic species in the chamber before cutting off completely. When the medics reached him, he was unconscious and muttering about darkness and hunger in the void. Admiral Helen Brooks received the emergency communication while reviewing fleet positions in her office on Earth. The message was fragmented and came through multiple relay stations before reaching human space. Zephyrus Prime had gone silent. All 12 billion Zephyrians had stopped communicating at exactly the same moment. Their planetary defense grid was still active, but no one was responding to hails from council ships. Helen had served in the human defense fleet for 30 years and had never seen anything like this. An entire species did not just disappear without warning. The Zephyrians were the most psychically powerful race in the galaxy. If something could silence them all at once, then it represented a threat beyond anything the Council had faced before. The first Krolix analysis teams reached Zephyrus Prime 18 hours after the silence began. What they found defied explanation. The planet was still there, and the cities were intact, but every living thing was gone. Not dead, but completely absent, as if they had simply vanished into nothing. The only trace left behind was a strange energy signature that the Krolix instruments could not identify. Jake Morrison was 3 systems away from Earth when the recall order came through. All human ships were being pulled back to defend core worlds while the Council tried to understand what had happened to the Zephyrians. Jake set course for home, but he could not shake the feeling that this was connected to the architect ruins he had discovered months earlier. A second attack came, without warning, just as the Council emergency session was beginning. The Thrakari homeworld of Bloodstone reported massive energy readings approaching from deep space. The planetary defense fleet moved to intercept, but their communications cut off mid-transmission. Within hours, Bloodstone had joined Zephyrus Prime. In the Great Silence, Council reconnaissance ships found the same thing at Bloodstone that they had found at Zephyrus Prime. The planet was empty of all life, but otherwise undamaged. The strange energy signature was stronger here, and the Krolix scientists detected traces of something they called biological technology. Ships that were alive rather than built. Jake reached Earth to find the human defense fleet preparing for war against an unknown enemy. The Council had designated the threat as extragalactic based on the approach vectors and energy signatures. The enemy ships were coming from the dark space between galaxies just as the Architect warnings had predicted. Whatever had destroyed the Architects millions of years ago had finally reached their galaxy dot. The third attack targeted a Krolix industrial world called Forge Prime. This time the Council was ready with surveillance drones and long-range sensors. They got their first clear look at the enemy ships, and what they saw changed everything the galaxy thought it knew about warfare. The enemy vessels were not ships in any conventional sense. They were living creatures the size of small moons with organic hulls that pulsed like heartbeats. They moved through space without any visible propulsion and seemed to feed on the life force of entire worlds. The Council scientists gave them the name Devourers because they consumed everything they touched. Jake watched the surveillance footage from the bridge of his new command ship, the Defiance. The Devourers did not use weapons in the traditional sense. Instead, they released clouds of smaller organisms that drained the life from anything they contacted. Planets that took thousands of years to develop complex ecosystems were reduced to barren rock in a matter of hours. The Council military tried everything they could think of to stop the Devourers. Krolix energy weapons barely scratched their organic hulls. Thrakari battle fleets were absorbed into the creatures before they could engage. Valthan's strategic planning proved useless against an enemy that did not follow any known tactical principles. Attempts at communication failed completely. The Devourers did not respond to any form of contact, whether telepathic, chemical, or electromagnetic. They simply moved from system to system, consuming every world they encountered. The pattern was always the same. Arrival without warning followed. By complete consumption of all life within hours. Jake found himself commanding a mixed fleet of human and alien ships assigned to protect the outer colonies. His orders were to evacuate civilian populations and fall back to more defensible positions. It was the kind of strategic withdrawal that went against every military principle he had been taught, but the Council insisted that preserving forces was more important than defending territory. The first colony ship Jake encountered was carrying refugees from the Kepler system. 5,000 humans, including many children, were fleeing ahead of the Devourer advance. Their escort consisted of 3 aging destroyers and a handful of fighter craft. Jake knew they would never reach safety at their current speed with Devourers. Pursuing them, the enemy caught up with the refugee convoy 6 hours after Jake made contact. Jake watched from the Defiance as the escort ships fought to protect the civilians. The destroyers opened fire with everything they had, while the fighters dove at the massive Devourer creature, trying to draw its attention away from the colony ship. One by one, the escort ships disappeared into the creature's organic mass. The pilots kept fighting even as their vessels were being absorbed, knowing that every second they bought might save the children aboard the refugee ship. Jake followed his orders and continued the evacuation protocol, but something inside him began to change as he watched good people die. The colony ship was the last to fall. Jake could hear the final transmissions from the captain as the Devourer organisms reached the hull. The man was still trying to coordinate the evacuation of the children, even as the life was being drained from his body. His last words were, "Apology for not being able to save them all." Jake Morrison had spent his entire career avoiding violence and finding peaceful solutions to problems. He had believed that every conflict could be resolved through negotiation and compromise. The destruction of the refugee convoy taught him that some enemies could not be reasoned with. Some threats could only be stopped through force. The Galactic Council met in emergency session to discuss surrender terms. Half the galaxy had gone silent, and the Devourer advance showed no signs of slowing. Several species were preparing to evacuate their populations to other galaxies rather than face complete extinction. The age of peaceful coexistence was ending, and something darker was taking its place. Jake stood on the bridge of the Defiance and stared at the tactical displays, showing devourer positions throughout the galaxy. Every projection showed Earth falling within weeks. The other species were talking about running away or giving up. But Jake remembered the escort pilots who had died protecting children and felt something he had never experienced before. Pure rage at an enemy that showed no mercy and could not be stopped through words alone. 3 months after the first devourer attacked, half the galaxy had fallen silent. The creatures moved through space like a plague, consuming every world they encountered. The surviving species had retreated to heavily fortified core systems, but even these strongholds were falling one by one. Fear ruled the galaxy now, and hope was becoming a rare commodity. Jake Morrison commanded the defense fleet, protecting the Sol system from his flagship, the Defiance. His quiet leadership style had kept human morale steady, while other species panicked around them. The Zephyrian survivors suffered from constant nightmares about their lost homeworld. The Krolix had retreated into obsessive research, trying to find some technological solution. The Thrakari spoke of honorable death rather than shameful flight. But Jake was changing in ways that worried his crew. He had stopped sleeping properly and spent most of his time studying devourer attack patterns. His wife Maria visited the ship whenever possible and noticed the difference in him immediately. The gentle man she had married was becoming something harder and more focused, something that frightened her even as she recognized its necessity. The nightmares started after Jake watched the refugee convoy die. Every night he saw the children's faces as their ship was consumed by the devourer organisms. He heard the last words of pilots who died buying time for people they would never meet. The guilt of following evacuation orders instead of fighting ate at him like acid. Maria found him standing at their bedroom window at 3 a.m, staring at the stars and muttering apologies to the dead. The breaking point came when the devourers reached the Centauri system. New Geneva was humanity's largest off-world colony with 4 million residents, including Jake's brother Danny and his family. The colony's defenses were strong by human standards, with orbital weapons platforms and a small fleet of patrol ships. Against the devourers, they might as well have been armed with harsh language. Jake received the first distress call from New Geneva while reviewing defensive positions around Earth. Danny's voice came through the communication clearly at first, describing the approach of something massive from deep space. The automated defenses were engaging targets, but their weapons seemed to have no effect. The colony ships were beginning evacuation procedures, but there were too many people and not enough time. Admiral Brooks called Jake into her office to give him the worst order of his career. The defense fleet was to maintain position around Earth, rather than attempt a rescue mission to Centauri. The projections showed that any ships sent to help New Geneva would arrive too late and would only weaken Earth's defenses. 4 million people would be sacrificed to potentially save the 8 billion on humanity's homeworld. Jake stood in the Admiral's office and felt something break inside his chest. The logical part of his mind understood the mathematics of the situation. Earth was more important than any colony, and the fleet's duty was to protect the greatest number of people possible. But the brother in him screamed at the idea of abandoning Danny's family to the devourers without even trying to help. For the first time in his military career, Jake considered disobeying a direct order. His hand moved toward the communication controls to signal the fleet to change course to Centauri. His crew was watching him through the office viewport, waiting to see what their captain would decide. The weight of command had never felt heavier than it did in that moment. The decision was made for him when Danny's final transmission came through the communication array. The colony's defenses had fallen, and the devourer organisms were reaching the civilian shelters. Danny was coordinating the last evacuation shuttles, while his wife got their children to the emergency bunkers. His voice was calm despite the chaos around him, as if he had accepted what was coming. Danny's last words were not a plea for rescue or a message of despair. Instead, he told Jake that their father had been wrong about one thing during their childhood. He had always said that the Morrison family's strength came from knowing when to speak up and when to stay quiet. Danny said that humanity's real strength was knowing when to stop being quiet altogether. Then the transmission ended, and Centauri fell silent. Jake returned to the bridge of the Defiance and stared at the tactical displays for hours without speaking. His crew gave him space to grieve, but they could see the change happening in their captain. The gentle man who preferred negotiation to violence was being replaced by something that scared even his closest friends. Lisa Grant later said it was like watching a sleeping volcano wake up. Maria came to the ship that night and found Jake in his ready room surrounded by tactical projections and Devourer attack patterns. She tried to comfort him, but he pulled away from her touch. When she asked what he was thinking about, he looked at her with eyes she did not recognize and said he was learning how to hate properly. The quiet man she had married was becoming something she had never seen before. The projections all showed the same thing. Earth would fall within 2 weeks based on current Devourer advance rates. The surviving council species were preparing final evacuation plans or surrender protocols. The Krolix had given up trying to understand Devourer technology. The Thrakari were planning one last suicidal assault to die with honor. The Valthan were calculating which galaxy might be far enough away to escape to Dot. Jake spent that night reading through every piece of data the galaxy had collected about the Devourers. He studied their movement patterns and attack methods. He analyzed their biological composition and energy signatures. Most importantly, he read the final transmissions from every world they had consumed, looking for patterns that others had missed. What Jake found in the data changed everything he thought. He knew about warfare and strategy. The other species had been approaching the Devourer threat as a conventional military problem. They were looking for technological solutions or tactical advantages that could be exploited. But Jake saw something different in the attack patterns. The Devourers were not just consuming worlds randomly. They were targeting specific types of civilizations first. Species with strong telepathic abilities, like the Zephyrians. Warrior cultures, like the Thrakari. Highly advanced technological societies, like the Krolix. They seemed to be avoiding certain types of targets until later in their campaign. Jake realized that the galaxy's greatest strategic minds had missed the most important pattern of all. The Devourers were not just feeding on life energy. They were eliminating potential threats in order of perceived danger. They had learned from their destruction of the architects millions of years ago, and were being more systematic this time. Humans had been ignored so far because they appeared to be the least threatening species in the galaxy. No telepathic abilities to coordinate resistance. No advanced weapons to cause serious damage. No warrior culture to inspire others to fight. The Devourers saw humanity as harmless, and were saving them for last when they could consume Earth at their leisure. Jake Morrison stood alone on the bridge of the Defiance and felt something fundamental shift inside his mind. The quiet captain, who had spent his career avoiding conflict, was gone. In his place was something harder and more dangerous. Something that understood that being underestimated could be the greatest weapon of all if used properly. For the first time since the Devourer invasion began, Jake Morrison smiled. It was not a pleasant expression, and his crew later said it made them glad he was on their side. The galaxy was about to learn that humanity's greatest strength had never been their technology or their telepathy or their warrior skills. It was their ability to surprise everyone, including themselves, when they finally decided to stop being quiet. Jake Morrison called for an emergency session of the Galactic Council, and what he proposed made most delegates think he had lost his mind. The plan was so different from conventional warfare that the Krolix representatives laughed openly. The Thrakari called it cowardice disguised as strategy. The Valfan said it violated every principle of military science. They had developed over thousands of years. Jake stood before the assembled delegates and explained his strategy with a calm voice that masked the fury burning inside him. The Devourers had been choosing their targets based on perceived threat levels. They eliminated the most dangerous species, first to prevent organized resistance. Humanity had been ignored because they appeared harmless, but that apparent weakness could become their greatest advantage. The plan required perfect coordination between all surviving species using their abilities in ways they had never attempted before. The Zephyrian telepaths would need to link directly with Krolix technology, creating a galaxy-wide communication network. The Thrakari warriors would have to fight with precision rather than fury, striking only when and where Jake ordered. Every species would have to trust humanity to coordinate the largest military operation in galactic history. Most of the delegates rejected the plan immediately. The Krolix said their technology was not designed to interface with organic telepathic abilities. The Thrakari claimed that coordinated warfare went against their cultural values of individual heroism. The Valfan insisted that no single species could coordinate forces across multiple star systems simultaneously. Jake listened to their objections with growing impatience. These were the same attitudes that had allowed the Devourers to destroy half the galaxy. Each species was so focused on their own strengths that they could not see how those strengths might work together. The enemy was winning because the galaxy's defenders were fighting as separate armies instead of a unified force. Commander Susan Torres arrived at the council chambers during the third day of debate. She had been Jake's instructor at the Naval Academy and was now the highest-ranking human military strategist. Susan brought with her classified protocols that most council members had never heard of before. Humanity had contingency plans for total warfare scenarios that had never been implemented because they had never faced true extinction. Susan explained to the shocked delegates the human military doctrine included provisions for species-wide mobilization in extreme circumstances. Every human civilian could be converted into a combatant within weeks. Every human ship could be modified for military purposes. Every human colony could become a fortress. The quiet, peaceful species the galaxy knew was only one face of humanity's potential. The transformation of Jake Morrison himself was proof of how quickly humans could adapt when necessary. The gentle captain who had spent years avoiding conflict was becoming something harder and more focused. His crew watched their commander study battle tactics with the intensity of a Thrakari warrior and the precision of a Valfan strategist. The change was disturbing, but also strangely inspiring. Jake's wife Maria came to see him during a brief break in the 10th council sessions. She found him in his quarters, surrounded by tactical displays and communication equipment. When she tried to talk to him about their plans after the war, he looked at her with tired eyes and said there might not be an after. The man she had married was disappearing into the role he needed to play to save the galaxy. The first test of Jake's new approach came when Devourer scouts entered the outer edge of the Sol system. Instead of following standard defensive protocols, Jake ordered an immediate counterattack using every available ship. His voice echoed across the communication channels as he coordinated the assault with a precision that shocked even his own officers. The attack caught the Devourer scouts completely off guard. They had been expecting the usual pattern of desperate defense followed by inevitable consumption. Instead, they faced a coordinated assault that struck from multiple directions simultaneously. Human ships worked alongside Krolix technology, and Thrakari fighters, wow, Zephyrian telepaths provided real-time intelligence updates. For the first time since the invasion began, a devourer force was actually driven back. The scout creatures retreated into deep space rather than face continued resistance. The victory was small in terms of actual damage inflicted, but its psychological impact was enormous. The galaxy had seen that the devourers could be hurt and forced to withdraw. Jake's war cry during that first counterattack became the template for everything that followed. His voice cut through the chaos of battle like a blade, giving clear, precise orders that every species could follow. The quiet captain who had preferred negotiation was learning to command through strength rather than diplomacy. The success of the Sol System defense convinced some council members to give Jake's strategy a chance. The Krolix agreed to attempt technological integration with Zephyrian telepaths. The Thrakari volunteered elite units for precision strikes under human coordination. Even the cautious Valthan began sharing strategic intelligence that they had previously kept classified, but implementing the plan across the entire galaxy would require resources and coordination on a scale never before attempted. Jake would need to become the single point of command for dozens of species spread across hundreds of star systems. The quiet explorer would have to transform into something the galaxy had never seen before. A human war leader whose voice could be heard across interstellar distances. Jake spent days preparing for this transformation with Susan's help. She taught him the psychological techniques that human military leaders used in extreme situations. How to project authority across vast distances. How to make decisions with incomplete information. How to accept responsibility for the deaths that would inevitably follow his orders. The most difficult lesson was learning to let go of the man he had been. Jake Morrison, the peaceful explorer, had to die so that something harder could take his place. The transformation was visible to everyone around him. His voice became sharper and more commanding. His movements became more precise and purposeful. Even his posture changed as he unconsciously adopted the bearing of a military commander. Maria visited him one final time before the main operation began. She found Jake standing before a galaxy-wide tactical display showing devourer positions and allied fleet movements. When she spoke his name, he turned to look at her, and she saw a stranger wearing her husband's face. The gentle man she had married was gone, replaced by something necessary but terrible. Jake told Maria that he might not survive what was coming, and that she needed to prepare for that possibility. The plan required him to place himself at the center of the largest battle in galactic history. If the coordination failed, or if the devourers adapted faster than expected, then the human command structure would be their primary target. He was becoming the most important and most vulnerable person in the galaxy. The final council vote was closer than Jake had hoped, but his strategy was approved by a narrow margin. The surviving species would attempt coordinated warfare under human leadership. Every available ship would converge on predetermined rally points for the largest military operation in galactic history. The quiet species that had been ignored by the devourers was about to announce its presence in the loudest way possible. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his flagship and prepared to give the order that would change everything. His transformation from peaceful explorer to galactic war leader was complete. The devourers had made a critical error in underestimating humanity, and Jake was about to make them pay for that mistake. The galaxy was going to hear humanity's war cry, and it would echo across the stars until every enemy knew that the quiet time was over. Jake Morrison's voice became the heartbeat of the galaxy's resistance as his commands echoed across 17 star systems simultaneously. The Krolix were amazed when human engineers helped them interface their quantum computers with Zephyrian telepathic networks, creating instantaneous communication across impossible distances. The Thrakari discovered that fighting with human tactical coordination made them more effective than they had ever been in their warrior culture's history. first major engagement took place in the Rigel sector, where 3 Devourer bioships were consuming a Krolix mining world. Jake coordinated the attack from his command center aboard the Defiance, while his consciousness seemed to expand across space itself through the telepathic network. He could see the battle from a dozen perspectives at once, in direct individual. Ships with precision that seemed almost supernatural. The battle lasted 14 hours and ended with the first confirmed destruction of a Devourer bioship. The creature died not from overwhelming firepower, but from perfectly coordinated strikes that targeted its biological weak points faster than it could adapt. Jake's voice guided every weapon discharge and every evasive maneuver until the massive organism finally went silent and drifted lifeless through space. But victory came at a terrible cost. 60 ships were lost in the engagement, including most of a Thrakari battle squadron. Captain Roy Barnes of the human destroyer Vengeance died, ramming his ship into a Devourer feeder organism to protect a damaged Krolix cruiser. Jake felt every death through the telepathic network and had to force himself to continue giving orders even as good people died following his commands. Devourers began adapting to human tactics faster than anyone had anticipated. Their bioships developed new defensive measures, and their attack patterns became more unpredictable. Jake realized that conventional warfare would not be enough no matter how well coordinated. The enemy had to be defeated through something they could not evolve countermeasures against. The answer came to Jake during a planning session with his senior staff. Lieutenant Ben Carter was reviewing communication logs when he noticed something strange about human battle chatter. Unlike other species, humans did not just coordinate tactically during combat. They talked to each other, constantly sharing encouragement and determination, even in hopeless situations. The Devourers had never encountered anything like human stubbornness in the face of certain death. Jake began incorporating this psychological element into his strategy. Human units were paired with alien forces, not just for tactical coordination, but to spread what the galaxy was beginning to call the human attitude. The willingness to keep fighting when logic said surrender was the only option. A refusal to accept defeat, even when facing impossible odds. The effect was remarkable to observe. Krolix crews that had been calculating surrender probabilities began pushing their equipment past safe limits to match human performance. Thrakari warriors who had been planning honorable deaths started thinking about impossible victories instead. Even the cautious Falfin began taking risks that their strategic training, Saad, were mathematically unsound. Jake's own transformation accelerated as the campaign intensified. The gentle captain who had once preferred negotiation was becoming something that scared his enemies and inspired his allies in equal measure. His war cries during battle coordination sessions became legendary throughout the galaxy. The quiet species had found its voice, and it was terrible and beautiful to hear. The decisive moment came when long-range sensors detected the main Devourer hive approaching the galactic core. The bioship was larger than anything they had encountered before, with dozens of smaller creatures surrounding it like antibodies. Intelligence estimates suggested it contained the controlling intelligence for the entire invasion force. If it could be destroyed, the remaining Devourers might become disorganized enough to defeat. Jake knew it was a suicide mission by any rational analysis. The hive was defended by creatures that had adapted to counter every tactic the galaxy had developed. Even if every surviving ship in the galaxy participated in the attack, the chances of success were minimal. But Jake had stopped thinking rationally weeks ago. When he watched his brother's colony die, the final briefing took place aboard the Defiance with representatives from every surviving species. Jake stood before the assembled officers and explained what he was asking them to do. They would jump directly into the galactic core, where space itself was dangerous, even without enemy forces. They would face creatures that could absorb entire fleets. Most of them would not survive the battle, Jake's speech to the galaxy was broadcast to every surviving world and ship. Lieutenant Ben Carter made sure that even the most distant colonies could hear their commander's final words. Jake did not talk about victory or glory, or any of the things that military leaders usually said before hopeless battles. Instead, he made a promise that humanity would make the Devourers pay for every world they had taken. The fleet that assembled for the final assault was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Human ships flew alongside Krolik's technology platforms and Thrakari battle cruisers. Zephyrian telepaths provided coordination, while Valthan strategists offered tactical analysis. Former enemies fought side by side, united by Jake Morrison's voice and the human refusal to accept defeat. They jumped. The galactic core took 18 hours with stops to avoid gravitational anomalies. Jake spent the time walking through his ship, talking to crew members from every species. He thanked them for following him into what everyone knew was almost certain death. Many of them said later that it was the calm way he spoke about dying that gave them courage to face what was coming. The battle at the galactic core lasted 72 hours and became the stuff of legend. Ships that should have been destroyed continued fighting with skeleton crews and failing life support. Pilots flew damaged fighters into Devourer organisms rather than retreat. Jake Morrison coordinated it all from his command center, speaking in a voice that cut through the chaos like a sword blade. The turning point came when Jake realized that the Devourers were not just feeding on life energy. They were feeding on fear and despair as much as biological matter. The more hopeless their enemies became, the stronger the creatures grew. But humans had brought something into the battle that the Devourers could not digest. Pure stubborn determination to keep fighting regardless of the odds. Jake's final command echoed across the galaxy as the human fleet drove straight into the heart of the Devourer hive. His war cry became the rallying point for every ship in the Yali. Battle as they followed their human commander into the impossible. The quiet species had waited until the galaxy needed them most, and then they had given everything they had. Devourer hive organism died not from weapons fire, but from something it had never encountered in millions of years of conquest. A species that refused to be consumed, even when facing extinction. The massive creature's death scream echoed through the telepathic network as its controlling intelligence finally understood what it meant to face an enemy that would not surrender. Jake Morrison collapsed at his command station as the battle ended and the surviving Devourers began their retreat into dark space. The quiet captain, who had become the galaxy's war leader, had pushed himself beyond human limits to coordinate the largest victory in galactic history. The cost had been enormous, but the galaxy was free, and humanity had proven that sometimes the most dangerous sound in the universe is the roar of someone who has been pushed too far. The Devourers were not destroyed through superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but through something their evolutionary programming could never comprehend. They had encountered a species willing to sacrifice everything not for survival, but for the principle that some things were worth dying for. Jake Morrison's final war cry echoed across the galaxy as the massive hive organism shuddered and died, taking the controlling intelligence of the invasion force with it. The surviving Devourer creatures fled back into the dark space between galaxies without their guiding intelligence. They moved like animals now rather than the coordinated force that had consumed half the galaxy. Some tried to continue feeding, but they were disorganized and vulnerable. The remaining council forces hunted them down one by one until the last bioship disappeared into the cosmic void. Jake Morrison was found unconscious at his command station when the medical teams reached the bridge of the Defiance. He had pushed himself beyond human limits during the final battle, coordinating forces across impossible distances through sheer force of will. The doctor said he might never fully recover from the neural strain of commanding so many minds simultaneously. Through the telepathic network. When Jake finally woke up 3 weeks later, he found himself in a medical facility on Earth, surrounded by flowers and messages from every species in the galaxy. The quiet captain who had become a war leader was now the most famous human who had ever lived. Representatives from dozens of worlds wanted to thank him personally for saving their civilizations from extinction. But Jake felt no satisfaction in the victory. Too many good people had died following his orders. Pete Rodriguez had been killed when the engineering section of the Defiance was breached during the final assault. Captain Barnes and hundreds of other brave souls had sacrificed themselves to protect ships they had never seen before. The cost of victory tasted like ashes in Jake's mouth. Maria came to see him every day during his recovery, but she could see that her husband was gone. The man in the hospital bed looked like Jake Morrison and spoke with his voice, but the gentle soul she had. Married had been consumed by the war just as surely as if the Devourers had taken him. The transformation that had saved the galaxy had destroyed the man she loved. The Galactic Council offered Jake the position of Supreme Military Commander with authority over all military forces in the galaxy. They wanted him to rebuild the defense networks and prepare for future threats from outside their spiral arm. Jake listened to their offer with dead eyes and declined without explanation. He had learned that some kinds of strength came with prices too high to pay twice. Jake's refusal shocked the council delegates, who could not understand why he would walk away from such power and responsibility. Admiral Brooks tried to convince him to reconsider, but Jake was adamant. He wanted to return to exploration ships and peaceful survey missions. The galaxy needed someone who could make the hard choices when war came, but Jake Morrison was no longer that person. The truth was that Jake could still hear the voices of everyone who had died under his command. The telepathic network had burned their final moments into his memory so deeply that he experienced their deaths over and over in his dreams. He had become an effective war leader by learning to think like his enemies, but the cost was losing the ability to think like the man he used to be. Lieutenant Ben Carter was promoted to captain and given command of the rebuilt Defiance. He came to see Jake before taking his new assignment and tried to tell him how much the crew respected what he had accomplished. Jake listened politely, but Carter could see that his former commander took no comfort from praise or recognition. The war had been won, but Jake Morrison had lost something that could never be recovered. Years passed and the galaxy slowly rebuilt from the devastation of the Devourer invasion. New colonies were established on worlds that had been consumed, and Hun left barren. The surviving species worked together more closely than ever, before having learned the value of cooperation during the darkest time in galactic history. The Council implemented Jake's coordination protocols as standard military doctrine. Jake returned to commanding exploration vessels, as he had requested, but he was no longer the same man who had once preferred quiet diplomacy to violence. His crew respected him, but they also feared him because they knew what he was capable of when pushed too far. The galaxy had learned that humanity could be terrifying when necessary, and Jake Morrison was living proof of that. Transformation. Ambassador Kelshawn of the Zephyrians wrote in his memoirs that the greatest lesson of the war was not about the power of coordinated resistance, but about the wisdom of choosing when to break silence. Humanity had proven that being quiet was not the same as being weak. The most dangerous beings in the universe were often those who chose peace until peace was no longer possible. The other species spoke in hushed tones about the day humanity's war cry had echoed across the galaxy. They remembered how Jake Morrison's voice had cut through the chaos of battle and united forces that had never fought together before. But they also remembered the cost of that unity and the price that one quiet man had paid to save them all. New recruits in the various military academies studied recordings of Jake's battle coordination during the final assault. They analyzed his tactics and tried to understand how he had managed to defeat an enemy that had seemed invincible. But the instructors always warned them that true leadership in desperate times required sacrifices that could destroy the leader. Even in victory, Jake Morrison continued to command exploration ships for the rest of his career, but he never again faced a situation that required him to become something other than what he chose to be. The galaxy was safer because of what he had done, but the man who had saved it was gone forever. The quiet captain had given everything, including himself, to ensure that others could continue to choose between silence and speech. The final entry in Jake's personal log was found after his retirement from active service. He had written that the greatest tragedy of the war was not the worlds that were lost or the people who died, but the realization that some enemies could only be defeated by becoming something you never wanted to be. The galaxy would always remember the day it heard humanity's war cry, but Jake Morrison would spend the rest of his life trying to forget the sound of his own voice. Years later, when new civilizations were contacted and welcomed into the galactic community, they were told the story of the quiet species that had saved the galaxy when all seemed lost. The tale became legend, and the legend became myth, but the truth remained simple. Sometimes the most powerful force in the universe is the roar of someone who has been silent too long and finally decides that the time for quiet has ended. Jake Morrison died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 87, surrounded by family and friends, who remembered him as a gentle man who had been forced to become something else when the galaxy needed saving. His final words were an apology to his brother Danny for taking so long to learn when to stop being quiet. The echo of his war cry would resonate through galactic history, but the man who had given voice to it had found peace at last in eternal silence.